And here we are again, Hornets. It is back to our source book for some notes and then our ready workbook on page 231. So if you don't have those things out, now would be a great time to get it. And pause me while you're doing so. Otherwise, we're going to get right into it. Keep our building of sentences up and running. Yesterday, we talked about phrases and how they're just a tiny part of a sentence. And today, and especially we focus on prepositional phrases, today we're going to expand that sentence structure and we're going to get you to write down what you see in front of you in your source book. And it is our notes on clauses. So, and just like Santa Claus, you can't, for those of us that celebrate Christmas and we just had that, Santa Claus, you've got to have the actual Santa part. If you just have a clause, you end up with, scratches and not the right kind of clause. Anyway, you need everything to go together. And so a clause contains both a subject and a predicate, which is the fancy word for verb, if you don't know by now. So a clause means it's going to have a subject of a sentence or a subject for your sentence and a predicate or a verb, something for your subject to do. Now, we have two types of clauses that we're going to get into a lot more in a couple lessons down the road. But just to give you an overview, an independent clause can stand alone. It is also better known as a simple sentence, which means it has a subject plus your verb plus the fact that it makes sense and it equals a sentence. Once again, an independent clause can stand alone. It's a sentence that can pay its own bills, can take care of itself, and it does not need any help. It's got a job and can handle its business. Now, our other type of clause, which is a dependent clause, needs some help, which is why most children are dependents of their parents or guardians. They don't have a job, they can't pay their own bills, they don't buy their own cell phone and pay for their cell phone. They depend, which is dependent, on someone else to help them out. So, even though both of these things have subjects, have verbs, they are a subject that can do their own things. An independent clause is a simple sentence. It can handle its business. A dependent clause, like dependents, need help. They've got most of the things that they're going to need, but they still can't do it on their own. And a lot of times, a dependent clause, also known as a subordinate clause, uses a subordinate conjunction, which we're going to get into some more later. But we've talked about coordinate conjunctions before, and those are your fanboys. Subordinate conjunctions are what we call our swabbies. And these are just a few examples because there's a lot of them. Since, when, after, because, if. Now, there's a whole lot more, but these is just our basics that I just want to touch on. Okay. Now, our next slide that we're going to look at, I'm going to hit present on this to get to our next one. Maybe. All right. This is the rest of your notes. Okay. So you're going to keep writing. So this is our example that I'm giving you. And yes, I want you to write your example. And it says, although Ripley was born in Alabama, her new family eventually moved her to Mississippi. Well, the very first thing I always want you to do when you get sentences and you're trying to figure out if it's independent or dependent, if it's a phrase or a clause, just like we did yesterday, you need to find your subjects and you need to find your verbs. You underline your subject once and your verb twice. So our subjects that we see, we've got in the first part of our sentence, I've got Ripley was born. So Ripley is my subject and she was born is my verb. Okay. Then on the other half of the sentence, it says her new family eventually moved her to Mississippi. Well, it's her what? Well, it's the family. And what do? They moved her to Mississippi. Okay. So those are your subjects and your verbs. Now, clause 1 says, although Ripley was born in Alabama. Well, if I just stop reading right there, it doesn't make any sense. It is a dependent clause. It cannot stand by itself. It needs help. Okay? So it's also, anytime you start a sentence, by the way, with a dependent clause, guys, you have to put a comma. All right. If you end with a dependent clause, you'll put a period, no matter what, at the end of a sentence. But if you start a sentence with a dependent clause, at the end of the clause, you're going to have to put a punctuation mark, and that is a comma. So it cannot stand alone. Clause 2, if I just cut out that entire, if I just like put a line through all of this right here and said, her new family eventually moved her to Mississippi, that sentence makes sense all by itself. Okay? It doesn't need any help. That's why it is independent. It can be by itself. All right? I could just easily capitalize that, turn it into a capital H, and it would say, her new family eventually moved her to Mississippi. And that makes sense all on its own. Now, keep in mind, the very first thing I always want you to do is to find your subjects and verbs. That's going to help you a whole lot. Okay? Now, next slide that we're going to look at is your work. Oh, look, it's your workbook page. So we're going to underline some stuff in our workbook page. Oh, but Miss Murray, we just wrote that. I know you just wrote that. We're going to underline it anyway. A clause contains a subject and a predicate. Remember, I told you predicate's a fancy word for saying verb. And once again, an independent clause, we're going to circle that as best we can. It can stand alone, but remember, because it can buy its own stuff and it doesn't need any help. And then you have a dependent clause, which means it's got to get an allowance, it's got to get some money, it's got to get some help. It doesn't make sense and cannot stand by itself. It's got to depend on that other clause to help it out. And our example that our book gives us says, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to go to the next slide, and that will probably help some. There we go. So our next one says, although Bearden was born in North Carolina, his family eventually moved to New York. Well, in your workbook, you can keep doing what I'm doing. That's fine. We're still in our workbook. So we're going to go ahead and underline our subject once. And our subject is Bearden. And our verb is was, just like earlier. We're going to underline that twice. We also said his family, once again, subject. And it moved. There we go. Woohoo. So we've got here, if we cut this out right here, if we scratched all this out and we didn't have it, and we just simply read, although Bearden was born in North Carolina, Burdan, I don't know why I keep saying Bearden. Oh, don't. Although Burdan was born in North Carolina, if that's all I said, what about it? Where's the rest of it? He needs help, okay? Which is why we have the rest of our sentence that helps us with, that way we can get some help. And it says his family eventually moved to New York. Now, the thing about the second sentence is that second independent clause, it can stand all by itself. I could get rid of all of this, and just saying his family eventually moved to New York would make sense. So let's go look at some practice. We're going to check out and see what happens when we break down some phrases and clauses, some drag and drop into our sentence structure building blocks. So you have got 8 answers at the bottom of your page, at the bottom of your screen. 4 of them are phrases and 4 of them are clauses. So let's figure out which one goes where. So I've got broke out. Is this a phrase or a clause? You are right. It is a phrase. What about when the war began? Well, if you're not sure, you need to do what we talked about earlier and see if it has a subject and a verb. Well, your subject would be the war, and your verb would be began. And if it has a subject and a verb, that means it has to be a clause. That is right. Now, just a little bit. Is this an independent or dependent clause? You are right. It is a dependent clause, because if I just read it, when the war began, it doesn't make any sense by itself. There's going to have to be something that's going to come later to help it out, right? Well, and let's look at our next one. I've got in the U.S. Army. Was there a subject or a verb? No, there's not. So we're going to drag it up here into our phrases box. It is just a prepositional phrase. In the 1960s, is there a subject or a verb? No, there's not. So it's a prepositional phrase. We're just going to drag it up here into the phrases box. What about the dog ran? Does it have a subject and a verb or even both? The dog would be your subject. You'd underline that once, and ran would be your verb. So we're going to drag that up here to the clauses. Now, what kind is it? Do you know? Good job. It is an independent clause. I can just say the dog ran. I could change that T to a capital T, and I could put a period after ran, and that makes complete sense because guess what dogs do? They run. Now let's go look at after he left. Is there a subject and or a verb? Good job. We'd underline he once and left twice, so that makes it go. If we have a subject and a verb, it's going to be a clause. Good job. Now, what kind of clause is it? Is it independent or dependent? Can I capitalize this A and put a period after left and the sentence makes sense? After he left. No, you can't. That's right. Good job. It's going to be a dependent clause. It needs some help. It cannot hang out all by itself. It's going to need somebody else to let us know what happened after he left. Now we got two more. We've got before pursuing art and because he helped. So, which one of these is going to be a phrase? And it's also a prepositional phrase. And which one of these is going to be a clause? Look for the one that has a subject and a verb because that's going to be your clause. So which one has a subject and a verb? Did you realize that you would underline once and helped you would underline twice, and that would be a subject and a verb? Because if you did, that is a fantastic job. Yay, you got it right. But what kind of clause is it? Can I capitalize this B and put a period after this and it makes sense because he helped? No, I can't, which means it's going to be a dependent clause. It's going to have some more sentence so that way it'll make sense later. So by process of elimination, because I told you there was 4 and 4, we're going to move our before pursuing art phrase over here. And it's a phrase because there's nothing down there to help. We're getting that no subject part of it. I get the before pursuing, but there's no actual subject. All right, so there was a little bit of practice. Hope y'all enjoyed that. And we're going to move on to our last piece of our guided practice. So, and it tells us that we are going to circle P for phrase or C for clause to identify the underlined group of words in each sentence. Then, if it's a dependent clause, we're going to write a D above the dependent clauses. Now, I told you, find your subject and your verb. We're going to go through there and do that real quick. So, number 1, my subject is he, and its verb is began. All right, number 2, my subject is I don't have a subject because after is a preposition, so that's good. There we go. Or a subordinate conjunction, depending on how it's being used. Then I got number 3. It's he. There we go. And he did what? He studied. That's a verb. There we go. And then my other one, I've got African art and Chinese landscape. Well, that is not a subject. There is no verb. Okay. It's just some words. Great. So number 1, before he began his career as an artist. Well, I just said it's got a subject and a verb, so that means it has to be a clause. Well, if I cut out the rest of my sentence, does it make sense? Before he began his career as an artist. Yeah, you see that right there? That is what we call a subordinating conjunction. I'm going to write an SC, which means this is going to be a dependent clause. It cannot stand alone. It would not make sense. Number 2, after college, he worked as a social worker in New York City. Well, there's no subject and there's no verb. So it can't be a clause, which means it can only be a phrase. Number 3, he studied the works of many European artists. Well, we already said he is my subject and studied is my verb, which lets me know, guys, it's going to be a clause if it has a subject and a verb. But if I cut this out, including Picasso and Matisse, if I cut that out and it just says he studied the works of many European artists, I could put a period right here and the sentence would make sense, which means it's going to be an independent clause and it can stand alone. So I'm going to leave that one. And number 4 says Bourdain also studied African art and Chinese landscape paintings. Well, the underlined part, what we already said, didn't have a subject or a verb, which means that it can only be a phrase. Okay. So that is all of our practice today for phrases and clauses. Tomorrow you will look at page 232 and we will keep up and work on this some more. If you have any questions, once again, you can email me or you can even send me the question in Google Classroom. All right. Thanks, guys.